There is a generation that grew up being told they were slackers, disaffected, cynical, the forgotten middle child squeezed between the boomers who got all the mythology and the millennials who got all the think pieces. But here is what the research is quietly starting to show. Generation X, born roughly between 1965 and 1980, may be the most psychologically resilient generation alive today. Not because they are tougher, not because they suffered more, but because of something that happened to them during a very specific window of development that most people have never thought carefully about. Let's get into it. First, what does psychological resilience actually mean? Not the motivational poster version, the clinical one. Resilience is defined by the American Psychological Association as the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress. It is not the absence of difficulty. It is the capacity to move through difficulty without being permanently destabilized by it, and it is not a fixed trait you either have or don't have. Research from the University of Pennsylvania, particularly the work of psychologist Martin Seligman, shows that resilience is built through experience, specifically through repeated exposure to manageable stress, followed by successful navigation of that stress. The key word is manageable. Too little stress produces fragility. Too much produces trauma. The sweet spot, what researchers call the optimal stress window, is where resilience actually develops. Gen X, almost by accident, grew up directly inside that window. Here is why. The latchkey generation. Between the 1970s and 1980s, dual-income households became the norm across America. Parents worked, children came home to empty houses, let themselves in with keys worn around their necks, made their own snacks, did their own homework, navigated their own boredom and their own conflicts without an adult to mediate. A 2019 study published in the Journal of Child Development found that children who experience age-appropriate autonomy, making decisions, solving problems, managing their own time, develop significantly stronger executive function and emotional regulation than those whose environments are heavily managed by adults. Gen X didn't have helicopter parents. They had parents who were working. The difference that created wasn't neglect, it was developmental opportunity. They learned at a cellular level that problems were theirs to solve, that boredom was theirs to resolve, that the world was not going to arrange itself around their comfort. That lesson, absorbed not from a book but from daily lived experience, is the foundational architecture of psychological resilience. Now here is where it gets more interesting. Stay with this because most people miss this completely. The second factor is perhaps the most underappreciated. Gen X was the last generation to have an unmonitored childhood. They played outside without supervision until the streetlights came on. They navigated social hierarchies without parental intervention. They experienced conflict, rejection, exclusion, and failure, and processed all of it without a smartphone to retreat into, without social media to perform on, and without an adult immediately available to regulate the experience for them. This matters enormously. Developmental psychologist Jean Piaget's research established that children need unstructured, self-directed play to develop the cognitive flexibility and emotional intelligence required for adult functioning. His findings have been replicated and expanded across decades of subsequent research. What we now know is that unmonitored peer interaction, the kind where children have to navigate conflict, negotiate rules, manage disappointment, and repair relationships without adult scaffolding, is one of the primary mechanisms through which emotional resilience is built. Gen X had this in abundance. Today's children, through no fault of their own or their parents, have significantly less of it. Playdates are scheduled, activities are supervised, conflicts are mediated. The unstructured developmental space that Gen X inhabited has been compressed almost entirely out of existence. This is not a criticism of modern parenting. It is an observation about what the research shows happens when that space disappears. The third factor is economic reality. Gen X entered the workforce during some of the most volatile economic conditions of the post-war era. The recession of the early 1990s, corporate downsizing, the dot-com collapse, the 2008 financial crisis hitting them precisely at the age when they should have been hitting their financial stride. Research from the Pew Research Center on Generational Economic Mobility found that Gen X experienced greater income volatility across their working lives than either boomers before them or millennials after them. What does repeated exposure to economic uncertainty do to a generation psychologically? According to longitudinal research from the University of Michigan's panel study of income dynamics, one of the longest-running studies of economic behavior in the world, individuals who navigate multiple economic disruptions develop significantly stronger financial adaptability and lower baseline anxiety about uncertainty than those who experience more stable economic trajectories. In other words, the instability that looked like a disadvantage was also building something. The capacity to function under uncertainty without being paralyzed by it. This is textbook resilience development, not despite the hardship, because of it. The fourth factor is cultural. Gen X came of age during the AIDS crisis, the Cold War's final chapter, the crack epidemic, and the rise and collapse of multiple cultural movements in rapid succession. Their formative years were marked by a persistent low-grade awareness that the world was unstable, that institutions could not always be trusted, and that adults did not have everything figured out. Psychologist Emmy Werner conducted one of the most important longitudinal studies on resilience ever completed. Following 698 children born on the island of Kauai in 1955 from birth through their 40s. Her research identified that children who developed resilience in the face of adversity shared a common trait. They had learned early that they could not depend on external circumstances to be stable, and so they built their stability internally. Gen X's cultural environment, skeptical, ironic, self-reliant by necessity, maps almost perfectly onto the psychological profile of Werner's resilient subjects. Now here is the important question. Does any of this matter today? Yes, significantly, and here is exactly why. Research published in the journal Psychological Science found that adults who demonstrate high resilience show measurably different physiological stress responses than low resilience individuals. Lower cortisol spikes, faster recovery to baseline, reduced inflammatory markers associated with chronic stress. Resilience is not just psychological, it is biological, and it appears to be built, not inherited, which means the conditions that shape Gen X's resilience can be understood, studied, and to some degree deliberately created. For parents raising children now. For institutions designing environments now, for individuals working to build their own resilience now. The generation everyone called slackers may have been quietly running the most important developmental experiment of the 20th century. And the results are starting to come in. If this made you think differently about your own generation, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you are Gen X, you already knew this. Protect your resilience.